coming in, but nonetheless, I think we should go. It's a very great pleasure this evening to introduce Mahr, who, as I'm sure you all know and will have seen the exhibition in the front members' room. And I feel sort of particularly kind of pleased and privileged to introduce her because the work that she shows is very different from a lot of the work that we currently show, even when it's kind of photographic. And it's worth pausing for a moment, I think, and just to think about that. And it may seem a very odd way of kind of coming to the issue. But the first thing I noticed about the response to the exhibition in the AA was that the response sort of came about from, it stemmed from kind of individuals. I mean, now of course at some level, you know, all remarks on exhibitions stem from individuals. But I think it had a kind of very particular significance. It felt that it was addressed as if its kind of ideal spectator was one person, and that was what the photograph addressed. It's quite to the contrary with a lot of representations of architecture which, as it were, are either not thought about in terms of whom you address, it's to a collectivity or it's to a sort of generic spectator. But I think people, and many students have said, both that they sort of noticed the difference between it and a lot of work shown at the AA, which of course is quite right at a number of levels, formal, whatever. But what had struck them was that they felt addressed one by one. And this might sound a rather abstract point, but I think it bears centrally on her practice of photography. I think it's both a wise, I think it's an intelligent, aesthetic strategy to pursue, although in some sense it's becoming rare. Perhaps it's only within the fantasy of the address to one, which starts almost that it's a reaction to one, her father, or to very individuated members of her family, or a community in Hungary. This capacity to speak one-to-one, to code the address of the photograph on the same basis, has something really to kind of teach us. You might say it's not the strategy of the manifesto. It's not the strategy of someone trying to take claim to some territory. It's not the announcement of a new movement. It is where the photography becomes part of a a kind of conversation which had started from the utterances or the objects of a single person and persists in its representation to being that, towards that of an individual. I think we could kind of discuss at a certain level the nature and the benefits. For benefits there surely are at a human level of such a way of working, which may seem intensely modest, intensely personal, in some sense intensely local. But because of those very things, it therefore speaks to all individuals who are always local, always, as it were, specifically mortal. And so it's with great pleasure I should also have mentioned the catalogue, where I found there was an extremely good article, a catalogue published by Serpent's Tail, the article by Amanda Hopkinson, which I think if you haven't read it, students here really ought to. I don't want to go on because I simply want to welcome you here to speak.
Thank you. I think I probably could talk to you without this microphone, but I'll stay here. I've been asked to talk about my photographs, and because my photographs are autobiographical, I think the best is if I tell you about my life and events in my life that may explain my preoccupation with certain subject matter, and also about certain things that helped me to become the sort of photographer I am. So I think you should know that I was born in Chile, and I was brought up in Hungary in the 1950s when it was a socialist country. And I have lived here now for decades, and I'm married to a New Zealander. So I'm a proud owner of a Hungarian, Hungarian, New Zealand, British, and a Chilean passport. And the more the merrier. I also would like you to know that I became a photographer at the age of 19, so that's some decades ago. I had all these friends who were all film students, and they needed somebody who had to take the stills while they were shooting their films, and I volunteered. And together with this group of people, I used to sit in the evenings in darkened studios watching French Nouvelle Vague films. And that period of my life has been hugely influential on the way I see the world. Especially, of course, Godard, for intellectual reasons, but also for a very shallow reason. And that is that I saw Restless, in which Jean Seberg plays a trainee journalist, and I loved it. I loved the lifestyle that portrayed, and I cut my hair short, like she did at the time, and at the time it was very, very unusual, and went straight to the Hungarian news agency and applied for an apprenticeship. It was a little bit difficult because they didn't want women to become photojournalists. But at the end, they accepted me, and I had the most fabulous 3 years working with photojournalists at the Hungarian news agency, and also attending the School of Journalism in tandem with this. Every day I did a different job. I was mostly helping photographers, and one day we would be photographing say the Royal Shakespeare Company playing King Lear. Another day we would be out on a football pitch, and the third day we would be lighting steelwork for photography. The emphasis was on comfort, on tradition. I had to work exactly like my predecessors did, and you didn't want to rock the boat. You wanted your photographs to look exactly like your colleagues, and the better you were at emulating their style, the better photographer you were considered to be. And of course, being a photojournalistic surrounding, the emphasis was on mostly on reflexes, and we did exercises like one of my colleagues would throw up a ping pong ball, and we had to take pictures of that ball and catch it right in the middle of the frame. And the more of them you caught right in the middle of the frame, the better, the more skillful you were considered to be. The time came when I had to apply for a permanent position, and that's where the problem came, because to be accepted for a permanent position, you had to be a member of the Communist Party, which I didn't want to be, for very personal reasons. And I didn't get the job. I got my qualification, but I didn't get the job, and I was so upset that I decided not to ever take another photograph ever again. So I put my camera down, and I really I chose another job for 2 years and went away from photography. I came to Britain, and at that time, after a year of learning English, it happened that I was again in the position to apply for to look for a photographic position, because I calmed down. Everything around me was so very different. I forgot all the things that hurt me back in Hungary. And I applied to the PCL, the Polytechnic of Central London, because I knew that the dean at the time, Professor Mahr, was very interested in different photographic techniques. And I knew already, sitting in my home thinking about my photography, that because of the way you change when you go from one country to the other, you lose your self-confidence. You can never be the same brash, self-confident and strong person that you were back in Hungary. That I would have to look for a new language. And I was so lucky because I chose the PCL, and the PCL was at the time the best place to be, not just because of the possibility of experimenting with different techniques, but also because in the first year they were teaching us chemistry and all about working in the lab and grayscale and zones and so on. And then in the second year, Victor Bergen came to the school. He obliterated all that, and from then on it was theory, wall-to-wall theory, and I was introduced to so many things that I didn't know about. Amongst others, I learned about a lot of artists, a lot of photographers that I never heard of, because Hungary was such an isolated country, both for language reason, but also for political reasons. Now, when I left the PCL, I finished the course there, I came away with the biggest help that it gave me was that I learned to break rules, which was a huge big thing in my case, because back in Hungary it was exactly the opposite, that I had to conform. Here I was allowed to break rules, and it opened up the whole world for me as it is right now. So I would quite like to show you now some pictures, and then through them I can talk to you about how things happened for me. Can I? Oh, I see. Shall I press it? I thought of starting with this picture, which is called Autograph. Way back, there was an experimental photography gallery in Cambridge, and they asked me, amongst all sorts of other people, to submit work for this exhibition. So the way I did, as I always work now and back then as well, I enlarged the photograph of my grandmother. I set up some candles in front of this photograph, burned them in her memory, and then rephotographed the image. In photography, photographing against artificial background has been around ever since photography has been around. I use exactly the same technique, that instead of painted background, I use photographic background. I use usually black and white photographs. I'll tell you later why. And I work in my studio. So it's nothing extraordinary. It's probably the fact that they are always black and white, and that they are I always start from a blank page. I add layers to it one by one. That gives this feel to my photographs. It's very important to me that I have full control over what's within the rectangle. Like this, I can do away with all the clutter, because I like very simple images, and I can also be so careful with composition, because the composition is very important to me. I personally think that is the best side of my photography. The same gallery asked me to submit for another exhibition, which was called Sky. Most photographers just sort of looked through their already existing photographs and chose the ones with sky in them. I thought that this would give me a really good chance to experiment with this field, because sky for me is the best place to be. This is not in Hungary, this is not in Britain, somewhere in between, and you will see that a lot of my work happens up in the air. At the time, is the mid-1980s, suddenly it became very fashionable to buy little photographs, other people's portraits, and little calling cards. And I felt really badly about it, because I remembered from way back from Hungary, when I used to be sent out to villages to take photographs of the people living there, what a responsibility it is to take a photograph of a person and say, this is that person. And when a friend of mine gave me these two little tin types, I felt very badly about having this in my home, because I didn't know anything about these people, but I knew that the two little tin types actually represented these two. So in a gesture of respect, I recreated a life for them. I called it About Photography. At the same time, of course, you would see whole photo albums being sold. But because these little photographs became so valuable and so sought after, the people who were selling these objects tore out all the portraits from this photo album. You can see it, how damaged it is. And although usually I use objects that have been in the family for decades, on this occasion I actually bought this photo album from a seller in a flea market. And as I always do, I feel the presence of these people who once inhabited these spaces so strongly that I again burned candles in their memory and rephotographed them. I called this ordered interiors. Now, when I showed this particular work here in Britain, I realized that absolutely nobody noticed it. Nobody said a word about it. When I expect Hungarians would understand and know why I burned candles in the memory of people who were in these albums. When I went to Argentina with an exhibition that a retrospective exhibition of mine that was sent there by the British Council, people were surprised and pleased because they said that this was about the plight of the disappeared. So they thought them deeply political, which of course I didn't create them as deeply political, but I understand why they should think that, because the gesture was the same. This series, which is just a set of 4 images, I called Presents for Susanna. I had a friend, Anna, who lived next door, and they went back to Brazil, and she took her little daughter with her. So in the last minute, I took a photograph of her against a blanket outside in our garden, and decided that I was going to continue giving her presents like I did when she was there, so that we keep our friendship. They went, and I started making these images. I gave her presents that I knew she would like. The gesture was almost like embellishing a totem pole, and I took 4 pictures. And I was going to continue this series forever, but I realized that as I was working away on this, of course, not just one day after the other, but every month or so, I would make another one with the same photographic background, which is her portrait. That somewhere in Brazil, she was growing up, so it became a nonsensical exercise, basically, because she was much older than she was on this picture, and the presents that I was giving her would not have pleased her anymore. When I came here, after a period of adjusting, I felt I needed to go back to Hungary, and usually what happened that in the minute when I crossed the channel, I felt at home. The rooftops were familiar, the cobblestones were familiar, and when I went to Geneva, of course, I was reminded of my childhood, and I made a series which is simply called A Few Days in Geneva, and it's about that, nothing more. And it is a set of, apart from that introductory picture, a set of 10 images which are in 2 rows. In the top row, I am walking around in Geneva, and in the bottom row appears the Chopin's Polonaise, which was a piece of music that I overheard coming out from a window. I often forget that the person in these pictures is not me, because she was this friend, Anna, whose daughter I was photographing earlier on, and she put on my clothes, and when I look at these ones now, I think it's me. There are more in the series, but I just brought a few to show you. I, of course, couldn't afford to go away all the time, so from time to time I would go off to imaginary travels. And this is one of them. I called it Idle Times. And it's about a man walking along the streets quietly, and he stops and he takes off and he flies up all the way out into the sky. This was, of course, everybody dreaming of flying, but I was also hugely influenced by Latin American magical realism and also Jewish magical realism, if one can call it that, Isaac Bashevis Singer. And so many films one has seen, of course. Another travel that I went on to go, and I really, really wanted to see the Chinese terracotta warriors, and I went to China. And in China, of course, which is a country that I know in a very superficial way, but I found myself in a culture where myth and reality doesn't separate. Apparently, people can see ghosts, especially women, and everybody is very superstitious. I also noticed that when I was looking at things, objects, I would think, for instance, of two slippers. I would look at two slippers, but they would be talking about togetherness. I would look at smoke, but they would be talking about transitory pleasures. I would look at a bed, and I would find that sinister, and they would talk about good luck and happiness. And so I made a whole series. I only brought just a few of them to show you about this language difference, and also how different that objects had different meanings for me and for them. Now, because of my language difficulties, I have always been intrigued by dictionaries, and I will talk to you about that a little bit later, and about words and what they mean. So naturally, I hooked on this. I was also talking about ordinary events that I noticed when on my travel, on my journey, when I went to factories or went to offices, and I saw certain things that caught my eye. And when we got as far as Guilin, which is the place where all those very famous flat mountains are that one sees in Chinese paintings, I realized to my surprise that those paintings, although look the same, they are all painted from life. I always thought, that like here, illustrators would go to a reference book, would copy those, and that's why they looked so similar, but not in China. On the river, I saw a barge full of painters, and all of them were painting from life these mountains in Guilin. And I also had a chance to go to Rarotonga. All my life I dreamt of going to this faraway island where there is warmth, there is sea, there is the plentiful flora. And in Rarotonga I found it. It's such a small island that you can bike around in 2 hours. When I was there, I noticed people were all forever talking about how the ancestors arrived to this island, and and the shoreline was such an important part of the island for them. I also noticed that every second building there was a church of a different denomination, and that these churches were there to convert the natives, of course, and that the people of Rarotonga were decorating their, or rather, this is not the right word, not decorating, but embellishing their tombstones in the same way as I make my images. But of course, when I went home, I felt really dreadful because after all, I was a tourist. And the effect of tourism on the natives was such that they wanted this wonderful island to be just like Hawaii. But then again, what right do I have to tell them not to build like they did in Hawaii? And hence I made this second series, which is all about how ill at ease I felt walking around there and imposing our Western expectations on them. Again, this is a long series, but I just brought 2 of them to show you. In 1989, my mother died, and again, like so many times when something very major happens in my life, I put my camera down and I don't want to take another picture ever again. And it was only 2 years later, when, probably not by chance, when I was in Spain, with an exhibition of mine, that I woke up in the morning and I knew that I wanted to make images for my mother. I made several series. This one is called Time for Sorrow, and it's just a set of 3 images. It starts with this little Chilean flag. Now, this we have had in our family ever since we came back from Chile to Hungary, and it was pinned on my mother's bookshelf. It is a little silk flag, which for us meant Chile and the life we left behind, but my mother always wanted to install in us the sense of belonging to South America. It is very difficult to photograph a flag because of all the other connotations and nationalistic intentions by others, but I had to use it. And this set of pictures I made for my mother, trying to thank her for teaching me all about magical realism. And this is the only series where something actually moves. The other series that I've made for my mother, called The Dreamer's Birthday, I made this for her because she truly believed, she was communist, and she truly believed that the equality for all was possible. Now, 2 years after her death, I made this series, the stars start falling down from the sky and go in one each into the in every single flat, and of course in the process they turn into 5-point stars. It's not my political views are not quite that of my mother, but I wanted to make this series for her because I believe that if there was no nepotism, if there was no greed, then probably her idea and her dream would have worked. At the same time, once I slowly became the age of my grandmother when I was a little child. And so I decided that perhaps I could talk about her now, because when I was a child, I was always very embarrassed about her. She had a very rebellious nature and was always testing me in particular, wearing all her fancy clothes or her beautiful silk dresses and the high heel shoes at the time when in Hungary everybody was wearing tracksuits and trainers. And in this series, which is a set of 8 pictures, again I make them pairs of images. In the top row, that's my grandmother in her fancy clothes. The reason why I use this faceless woman to stand in for her, because at the time I used to forever look for her face in books and publications that came out about the 1930s and 40s in Paris. And in those pictures of cafes, I would always see her friends, artists, photographers, writers, but I never found her, but I know all the stories. So the background for this is France, and all the objects again are hers, the horrid high-heeled shoes, and her rouge, her bag with her initials, for Vaida Anniko. The most difficult was for me to talk to my daughter, and this is the series which I called My Daughter, My Darling. The Hungarian version of it sounds much less sweet. She was interested, she wanted to become a theater director at the time, so her vocation was the theater, and I decided to talk to her within a theater stage. I made the stage. I put this in front of this large photograph of the Chilean landscape. This photograph was taken by a Chilean photographer called Antonio Quintana, and it was a large black and white photograph, more or less the size of my photographs at the moment, which he gave to my mother. And my mother brought it all the way from Chile to Hungary under her arm, because it was dry mounted on a board, so it was quite cumbersome, but she did. And this photograph also was just like the little Chilean flag up on top of her bookshelf for us to remember. And I thought that my daughter belonged there too. And in this theater stage, I talked to her about things that I thought might give her idea where does she come from. This is a row of books that she took off my mother's bookshelf when my mother died, and we were and because I have got sisters and we all have daughters, we all had to have something of her, and my daughter got this row of books. So I took them off the bookshelf, put them into theater stage to start off the series. This is about her and her identity, the picture in the foreground she took when she once came home back from Egypt, and took it in one of these photo booths, covering her face like they do in Egypt. And in the foreground, you will see a whole lot of identity cards. Here, people are very worried about having identity cards, but in my family, those are very important. And for instance, when I came to Britain and I was given my very first library card, I felt I belonged. And so there you will see my mother's identity card, my grandfather's identity card, mine, and my daughter's, to give her security. In this one, which is in this image, which may seem quite symbolic, it isn't. She, as a little girl, used to love playing chess, and she was both black and white because when she didn't have her friends around, and that was rather unusual. So I thought I remember that. And also, I remembered how my mother used to always say to us in Spanish, "Salud, dinero y amor," which is luck, health, and love. And the last picture in this series had to be about my mother. I almost like a shrine to her, because she was really the head of the family. My daughter, for a long time, when she was very, very little, thought I was her sister, not her mother, because my mother was such a strong personality. The 9 pictures are, when I exhibit them, are put up like this in a grid of 9, and it is this I just photographed out of a book, but I thought probably you would like to see it, how they are shown. In the early 90s, when suddenly everything changed in Eastern Europe, I went back to Hungary and realized that I found myself in a country that I hardly recognized. It was a completely different place. So I ran back and decided to make a series of photographs that explains where I belong. The series I called Life Chances, and naturally I had to go all the way back to 1938, when my parents, because they were Jewish, they had to leave France, and the only country that would take them was Chile. But before they could leave on a boat, I noticed that from all those letters that we kept from those times, how often they had to change the address, going from one little hotel to another, or one address to another, fleeing. They took the boat to Chile. As I said, the only country that would take them. Decades and decades later, when I was given a chance to go to South America, because one of my retrospective exhibition was taken there by the British Council, I dreamt on the plane that I descended into this place, in this black and white country, that was just exactly like all those little photographs that my mother took when she arrived. And the cars were old, and people were hurrying past in these tiny little narrow streets. And of course, when I woke up, I realized how comfortable I felt in that surrounding. When I actually landed, Buenos Aires was fantastic. It felt so homely. the taste of food, the language, the way people were behaving felt just like home. Suddenly I understood so much about myself and my parents. This image is about these two letters, Enya and Ella, which in Spanish, which makes the Spanish such a lovely language for me to listen to, especially the South American, the Chilean version of it. And I suddenly realized, why is it that I like peanuts so much? I went to the cafes, and then, of course, there you walk up to your ankles in peanuts. And even that was explained to me. Walking into this courtyard, I was reminded of my grandmother, who was always talking about etiquette and how to behave and how to eat and how to sit at the table. And of course, I was reminded of all the different religious influences and that I was confronted with when I was a child. This image, which I made with the intention of talking about the time when, as a little child back in Chile again, we used to be playing outside on the street outside our house. And we had marbles, and we were forever talking about what would happen if we found some jewels and what would find some treasure. Now, interestingly, when I showed this to my sister, who is more or less my age, she almost burst into tears, because for her this was about those times when the Hungarian Jews were let down on the banks of the Danube, and all their wealth was taken away, and then they were shot in the mouth. It makes me feel very responsible about how to make images. And I saw garlic everywhere. Again, that was explained, though I have to say garlic is not just South American obsession, it's also Hungarian. It's about keeping the vampires away. Then, of course, in 1948, I was taken back to Hungary, and I was brought up, as I told you earlier on, during the Stalinist era. And in this picture, I remember a man who used to live across the road from us, who used to be obsessed with Lenin and was painting Lenin pictures all the time. All the walls of his apartment were covered in Lenin paintings. I also remember that it was forbidden to go to church, and my friend was devout Catholic. We were little, and we were always together, so I just had to go with her to the church, to this clandestine Sunday school. And sitting in the chairs, little as I was petrified that God was going to descend and tell me, "What are you doing here?" The other thing that we did as children, that for the 1st of May, we had to make a little garden in front of our house. If you had a tree, then around the tree. If you had a lamppost, then around the lamppost. And then this man would come with his clipboard and would give you marks for this little garden that you made. And this was all also in celebration of Michurin, the great agricultural hero, Russian agricultural hero. I was also given a 5-point star for being a good worker. I wasn't very appreciative. And then I remember the time when I was at the Hungarian news agency working as a journalist, and we all believed in recording reality. And actually looked down upon experimental photographers. And one day, as I was walking along the corridor, I saw this bundle of wheat and a photograph of clouds. And I suddenly realized that these were the ingredients, and it was sort of cordoned in one corner, cordoned off in one corner. And I suddenly realized that these were the ingredients of the photograph of our Stalinist leader, Rákosi, sampling the plentiful harvest. I was furious at the time. You know, I thought I was cheated. Little did I know that I was going to spend my whole life making images like that, because if you want to have full control over what of your message, then that's how you should make your images. Now, I think it was 1991, the National Museum of Photography gave me a digital camera, and I fell in love with. It was a cumbersome thing, quite a huge camera, no LCD viewer on it. It was attached to a huge monitor, but I could, for the first time, try out this new process. And from then on, I could hardly wait for the time when all the digital equipment was good enough for me to do my work with. So when that happened, at least the computer got good enough, I decided to master Photoshop and embarked on this series, which are called New Places, New Codes, Tales of an Expatriate. And I wanted to show you this because a lot of people were very worried that I might change my style and my topics of conversation, but of course you don't have to do that. I decided to tame the process to do the work that I want to make, and it was enough really for me to learn that much of it to start creating images. Within this series, I started talking about my good old story, you know, about trying to work out where I belong and talk about certain objects that were particularly important in trying to make sense. Every time I change from one culture to another, try to make sense of my surroundings. So naturally the dictionary comes into it. This picture I call Solitary Pleasures because I used to be by myself a lot, always with dictionaries and Larousse encyclopedias and so on, leafing through them when my English wasn't good enough to talk to other people. Recollections come in again from my childhood, for instance, when I remember this old man who used to sit in the park where I used to play, and he would be sitting there, falling asleep slowly, and then suddenly this alarm clock went off, and he would reach into his pocket and got out this large alarm clock, put it off, and then stood up and slowly walked home. Then, of course, part of this series had to be about common objects, because just so that you see the sort of problems that I come across. You know this little English song, I am a little teapot, short and stout. Now, when grown men sing that and they go all soft in the heart, I just couldn't make sense of that at all, so I just wanted to give it some strength and knock the side off. And it's only when my grandchildren were born and they started singing this song that I understood the song, and now I love it. So I call that, this is in the series, within the series it's called Common Object. This is Common Object 2. An ordinary person would go to to Wimbledon Common, like I do, and if he or she found a cricket boot, they would take a photograph there and then, but not me. I take the cricket boot home and photograph the common separately, and then put the two together at home, because it is so much more than about that vision of the cricket boot on the common. It's about how I cannot for the life of me, after so many decades living in this country, understand cricket. And football, not that I'm a huge football enthusiast, but it had to be mentioned, because this is in memory of the time when Hungary beat England in 1954, and we were listening to that game from loudspeakers in this camp where I was as a young pioneer. Now, I wanted to show you this image, which is called Restless Journeys, but the reason why I wanted to show you is because this building appears in other images as well. And I really believe it is okay to go back to the same place time and again, because there is no way in which you can just have one thought about the place. So some people are wondering how come this is the same background. Well, it isn't actually, but it is the same building. I called it Restless Journeys. The exhibition that I have here, I made in memory of my father, or rather a tribute to my father. And this image that starts the exhibition is a little enamel plate that used to be on his door, of his office door, and it says in Hungarian, because in Hungarian we reverse the order of the name, Tibor Weiner, architect. In the series, this is probably the most difficult one for me to talk about, but in the series I have collected all the objects that I have of him, and perhaps, I don't know whether you have read my little piece of writing in this pamphlet that has been put on your chairs, that as a child I wasn't allowed to touch his professional instruments, and so in doing so, although it is a tribute to him, but it also is some rebellion on my part, because I actually touch them and use them and making images. However, I am so proud of my impeccable sense of composition that I am absolutely I'm sure that he would have approved of these images. I'm sure he would have approved of the images. Whether he would have approved of the whole series, I'm not so sure, because he was very demanding. And perhaps they are not modernist enough. You see, that's my worry. That's my worry. This is just a little interesting aside, that this is called Studium Darby, but in fact they are Hungarian staples, and I cannot understand why they were called Darby, Studium Darby. The sensory flattering favored by the modernists, and I believe the Bauhaus was the first architectural school where students were encouraged to actually touch mortar and bricks. I went to Geneva, and near the lake there is the little house that Le Corbusier built for his mother. And when I was standing in his little studio, and I mean little, it is such a small space where he would work when his mother was there. I remembered my father, so I used the staples again to build high-rise buildings for him. Using his calling cards from Chile, this is why this is in Spanish, arquitecto, I decided to again make a tower for him. This notebook that I found, which is his, is really very interesting because of the notes he took. This is just any old notebook, you know, because we have a pile of them, but it says that you must listen to the young, that the old people's ideas are tainted. And he talks about freedom and honesty. These are his personal notes. Now, I was wondering whether I should bring you this or not, just to say that now I am forever in Edinburgh, and and I am making pictures about that city because I used to be walking around as a tourist, but now we have discovered that my husband's great-grandfather was born there and died there and lived there for 94 years, so we can walk around with our heads held high and feel that we belong. So I just brought two so that you see what comes next. And if you have any questions, please ask. I am not very accustomed to talking in a microphone. I have to apologize for that.
You wanted to talk a little bit about your use of scale.
Well, it's only about one thing, that as a child, when you concentrate on something, that's all you see. And this is one thing that I have kept. I hook on something, and that is the center of my attention. I focus on it. And so I wanted that to become, I wanted to make my images like that because of the way I think and the way I concentrate on things. And I also wanted to make sure that people understand that it is a subjective layer that I add to the background is the location, and then I add the subjective layer on top, that these are meant to be almost like documentary photographs, but with a very visible subjective layer on top. Now, interestingly, once I don't know whether this gives me that quality, but once a journalist was writing about my photographs, and he said, he was praising my photographs, but then he said, oh, maybe she just has a foreign accent. But of course, if I have a foreign accent in my photographs, then I am delighted because then I found my language in photography as well.
And do you know when you construct a picture, when you put the picture together, when is the point when you put the little objects around, when is the point when you realise this is it?
I usually work out the images in advance, you see. I know what I'm going to talk about, and I know what a lot of it happens in preparation, and then by the time I take, I don't take too many shots, you know, I just take maybe 2 or maybe maximum 3, but usually just 1, because it is so well thought out, you know. So, and the moment when I know that it is, I got there, is that when the image is printed and I sit in front of it and I feel this sense of equilibrium inside me. So that's what I do. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I was wondering, you said you wanted to explain about your use of black and white photography rather than colour.
That's because I was back in Hungary. I was trained as a photographer in black and white. It was I told you that it was a country that was really isolated for so many reasons, and that there was no color material available. So I got used to using it. And also, I like the abstraction of it. You know, I like that distance between real life and the sort of world that I'm talking about.
But you did do a series in colour, didn't you, on Georgia O'Keeffe?
Yes, but that's natural because I learned about her in colour. You know, I also the paintings. It had to be in colour. So occasionally I do color work, but it has to be justified like that. Yes. Because I think in black and white.
Have you ever taken any architectural photographs considering your father built Stali Varos, I think?
Yes.
Because you haven't shown any.
No, because I made some, but wasn't brave enough to bring them. That's the problem. I'm overwhelmed by this place actually. So, but I am. This is a topic that keeps coming up anyway. You know, I go through my career. I have been taking pictures to do with architecture.
I was wondering, you mentioned about digital cameras. Do you
Yeah.
use digital cameras all the time now? Or do you prefer them to the old-fashioned?
No, at the moment I am using digital cameras all the time, but it doesn't mean that I will forever use only digital cameras, because I'm also very comfortable with analog cameras, and so I just like to leave all those open, because what I like about photography, that it is such a broad medium. It is okay to experiment. It is okay to give space to something new like this, you know, I took digital photography on because I like the challenge, but and it's very comfortable for me right now. But I'm not ruling out analog. So it is becoming more and more difficult, because slowly everything is disappearing. Like I used to make all my photographs on candy art paper, and then you can't get it anymore. Or, you know, I wanted to make black and white slides, and then nobody would develop them anymore. And so it's becoming difficult, but hopefully there will be enough people still using analog equipment for it to carry on.
Any more questions? Yes.
I like your composition of your photograph, but I can also feel that it's very much under control, that the message that you want to deliver, although it's not on the frame, but it's precisely delivered. But I just wonder if there are some photographs that
but I hardly ever use them. You know, when I make my images, it's such a structured way of working. It's very laborious, cumbersome, but I do it like that. So I take photographs. But I actually, I mean, it makes me think because, like for instance, when I went to China, I knew I wouldn't be able to go back there again soon. So I took more images than I actually needed. I knew I was going to make a series about the terracotta warriors. I knew while I was there that I was going to make a series about this business of language. But I wanted to be sure, you know, so I was taking more location shots than what I actually needed. So perhaps you would consider those ones as chance images. I don't know. Did I answer you?
No, it could be an answer. Like, for
Sorry?
example, it could be an answer.
It could be an answer. Ask me again.
No, it's just like I mean, maybe most of us who are not photographers, but who like occasionally take photographs,
Yes.
especially like traveling to a new country or
Yes.
a foreign country.
Yes.
That, I mean, to me, it's like sometimes some photographs they are out of focus, or those are taken like by chance or mistake, are somehow more memorable than.
But you don't know me. I don't take too many photographs. You see, I don't. It's my husband who takes those photographs. I just take the ones I want. I don't. This is the difficulty, you know. Like for instance, I didn't bring you with in tandem with this Edinburgh series. I'm also making a series about Paris, where for the first time in so many years, we have been married for so many decades now. My attention was on us and my husband rather than the distant memories of my childhood. So this is the first series when I'm talking about now rather than back then. You see, so I don't take too many pictures. I never carried my camera around with me on just any old walks or when I go about my business, until I got this Leica camera, which I love so much, which inspired me to do the series about my father, you know, because this is perfect. It's light and it sits well in my hand. It's just perfect. So I carry this one around, but I usually